From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman, who is back with us after having a bout with the flu. Welcome back, David.
It's great to be back.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is going to be a good program on emulation.
Yes, it is. And on the show today, we're going to talk about not only emulation, but Vikings. Not the Minnesota Vikings football team and not Leif Erikson. We're going to talk to activist and author George Lakey about his book, Viking Economics, how Scandinavia got it right and how we can too. I remember during the last presidential election campaign that Bernie Sanders, he would hold up a place like Denmark as an example of a country that had a high standard of living, great social safety net, free education, universal health care. And many commentators in this country would decry him for making the comparison because the U.S. was too big and diverse a country to be able to afford or implement those kinds of policies. Well, Mr. Lakey is here to help us sift through what is fact and what is myth in that regard. Now, that's in the first half of the show. In the second half, we're going to talk about something we all can relate to on an everyday basis, and that is the robocalls we get from telemarketers. We're going to welcome Ian Barlow, who works at the Federal Trade Commission, which is the government agency that deals with consumer issues. And those of you who know Ralph's history know that it was the FTC where the first batch of young Nader's Raiders cut their teeth in the late 60s. In fact, it was covering those hearings about deceptive advertising where Washington Post journalist William Greider actually coined the term Nader's Raiders. So Mr. Barlow is the coordinator for the Do Not Call program at the FTC. So if you're tired of getting those kinds of calls, be sure to stick around for that conversation. As always, we will take a break in the middle to catch up with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's see what the Vikings are doing and what we should be doing. David?
George Lakey is a sociologist, author, and activist who, for over 6 decades, has led more than 1,500 social change workshops on 5 continents. The first time he was arrested was back during the Civil Rights Movement. He was recently arrested during his successful campaign to stop the nation's 7th largest bank from financing mountaintop removal coal mining. Those kind of experiences have informed his new book, How We Win, a guide to direct action, nonviolent campaigning. He's also the author of Viking Economics, How the Scandinavians Got It Right and How We Can Too. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor George Lakey.
I'm delighted to join you.
Yes, indeed. Let's get right to your brand new book, which is a paperback called How We Win, and the cover has a V for Victory sign, and it has some pretty good endorsers. Bill McKibben endorsed it. People who have written about civic action, Rebecca Scholnet endorsed it, and many others. And so I have a controversial question to start out. As you know better than most, there have been quite a few good books on civic organizing, nonviolent protest. Of course, all probably have read The Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, the Chicago-based premier organizer of his time. So let me ask you this question, because it's the same experience I've had. I mean, I've sponsored and written books like that. Public Citizen Action Manual was one. The more recent one, Breaking Through Power, it's easier than we think. And while it doesn't have the granular detail that your fine book has, I think suffers the same neglect, which is these books never become bestsellers. They're often not even used by neighborhood organizers. What is it about the psychology of civically engaged people that doesn't get them to use these manuals the way a video game player uses a manual or the way a bridge player uses a manual? Because it's a learning process, and citizen activism should always be a work in progress in terms of developing greater and greater expertise and impact.
Well, what I've found among many, many organizers and activists is a belief that the particular situation they're facing is unique. Even one town to another, it's amazing how this town, where I see something remarkable is going on, and then the next town, next bookstore or something, I want to talk about it, and people say, oh, but this town is different. We aren't the same as that town. So this insistence, a kind of reflex, my situation is unique, gets in the way of people understanding that there's tremendous lot to be learned. I completely agree with you that it's completely crazy considering that so many of the professions really use best practices as the way they proceed, the way they solve problems. It's a weird kind of cultural tick, I think, among activists.
And it's self-defeating as well, because the more you get into the experience of people who've done organizing and learning from them, this book is, 220 pages, the more you realize that you're not going far enough toward the decision maker. So I'm on a real Congress focus here. And do you have that same experience, that they don't go all the way to the final decision makers that can fulfill their dreams?
Well, I completely agree that the decision makers need to be approached, and they need to be approached with a tremendous source of power. And part of, I think, the culture of many activists is a belief that we're not really powerful enough to make a difference. That is, there's growing evidence that it's the economic elite and growing evidence in political science as well as among people's perspective that the economic elite really rigs things and are the puppet makers behind the puppets who are Congress. And if that's the case, then how can we really stand up and be able to make that happen? Which is why I wrote this particular book, because I went back 100 years and asked empirically through research, what were the different movements doing that enabled them to overcome the opposition that was being reflected in the Congress of the day or the president? What is it that enabled them to overcome the opposition in order to get progressive things to happen? And very often it was the use of a nonviolent direct action campaign that really put them over the top. The civil rights movement being full of clear examples, but all the way back to the women's suffrage movement that during World War I, against enormous opposition from Congress and from the President of the United States, were able to prevail because the women figured out how to use nonviolent direct action in such a specific and focused way that they were able to overcome the opposition. So that's why I wrote the book, actually, because I thought if people are feeling fairly powerless, fairly helpless when they look at Washington and know how corrupt it can be, then what they need is to empower themselves through using a technology, a power technology like nonviolent direct action that can actually prevail.
And all the past changes at the national level had to go through Congress. We got safer cars because of Congress, and pressure from the people. Women's right to vote constitutional amendment at the start in Congress, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the workers' rights, the labor union laws, the progressive taxation, Medicare, Social Security. You think people would get the idea after a while, but part of it is they go through elementary school and learn nothing about civic engagement and civic skills, even though they're very idealistic and would love to connect with problems in their community, with what's happening to the rivers or the estuaries or where the drinking water comes from or how the town hall takes care of the roads and bridges. It doesn't happen. So we can't rely on the educational system, although that's part of direct action, I think. We get more civic skill teaching and engagement in the classes,
that's right.
or afternoon classes for students if they can't get the curriculum changed.
One of the lessons from the civil rights movement actually was starting smaller, in a sense, smaller. That is, 50,000 black people boycotting buses in Montgomery, Alabama. So that wasn't Congress, right? That was going up against their local opposition, the segregationist opposition. But the important thing about that struggle, 1955, was that they won their local struggle and in the course of that empowered themselves so that other black people around the Deep South, especially the students, moved very vigorously forward in the sit-in struggle. They empowered themselves by understanding we can win here, win there, win here, win there, and then build up to the point where, with the Birmingham struggle, they could actually force Congress to act. And that was a very reluctant Congress because it was by and large a Democratic Congress, which didn't want to lose the solid South and didn't want to suffer the political consequences of being on the side of civil rights. But they were forced to do it anyway because the direct action, the dislocation of a major industrial city called Birmingham, Alabama, and the eyes of the world being upon the United States in a very exposed way, all of that put together forced Congress to move.
We all know it starts with people back home connecting with some allies in Congress and then expanding the power in Congress. But I'm amazed at how people know where it has to start, but they don't seem to know where it ends. So the idea of summoning their senators and representatives, it only takes about 500 distinct names on a petition with addresses to get a senator to come to your town meeting. We actually published the formal summons, and they can't do it. I've talked about again and again, and they've convinced themselves they can't get the senators or representatives back to their own town meetings with the people's agenda, not the choreographed political town meetings that members of Congress have during congressional recess. And this has been going on and on year after year. I've talked about it. Others have talked about it. We've never had a Congress watchdog group be formed, even though it could be on an agenda supported by conservatives and liberals. As you know, there are a lot of changes in this country. The polls show supported by conservatives and liberals. Living wage is one. Full Medicare for all is another. So what do you think the problem is in the psychology of the inclined civic activists here? Let's not just talk about...
Well, I think, Ralph, you're documenting actually by the use of terrific examples this helplessness that people feel. People feel overwhelmed. And one result of that is a declining legitimacy of federal government because people are more and more feeling it's simply rigged and there's no way that we at the grassroots can make a difference, which is why I wrote a book called How We Win, because if we learn to win by tackling goals that are reachable by us, which isn't, it's not likely that a town is going to make a huge difference nationally by mobilizing itself. But on the other hand, if Montgomery Black people can win in Montgomery, if a nuclear power plant can be stopped, say, going back to the 60s and 70s in that particular region, then people who are facing nuclear power, the threat of that in other parts of the country, also mobilize, because what does inspire us to move us out of the helplessness that you so accurately point to, what inspires us to move past a sense of helplessness to go ahead is to see people winning and realize, whoa, we can do that ourselves.
There's something none of us have figured out, no matter how experienced we are. You go back 6 decades, I go back 6 decades. We've talked to tens of thousands of people. We've worked with thousands of people, and with some success here and there. But it does seem that the concentration of power is the worst that it's been in a century. And the members of Congress, with some exceptions, have been more indentured in more ways to corporate power that it doesn't suffice anymore to say people feel helpless, hopeless, because they're getting harmed. If you had a family and your health insurer, with your premiums up to date, denied care and a member of your family died, and this happens a lot in the country. Harvard Medical School study shows that even now under Obamacare, 35,000 people die because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. You can imagine how many die from being denied under their health insurance. And still, they don't get angry. They get angry if there's a TV blackout of a football game. They get angry if they get ripped off by a cab driver. They get angry if certain slurs, ethnic, gender, racial slurs, they really go nuts on campus against bad words, but they don't mobilize against bad deeds. Now, who's beaten the fight out of the American people? Entertainment, 24/7, internet, cell phone, addictions, fear, being sued. What is it, George Lakey?
I think all of those are factors, and yet there's one that doesn't tend to get paid attention to, and that is the lack of vision in our political culture. that is very differently actually from the 60s and 70s when there were a lot of visionaries around, you being one of the prominent ones, who were imagining and being able to be graphically descriptive for people. What would it be like to drive a safe car and so on? That envisioning what it could be if we joined together and pressured to make that happen, that tended to retreat because I think the Ronald Reagan led counteroffensive that put the corporations back in the saddle very securely. And so you gave up dreaming and started instead to think, well, if we could at least hold on to previously attained gains that we've made. And most of the popular movements in the US from the 80s on went into a defensive mode in which it was, how can we hold on to this? How can women hold on to reproductive rights and so on and so on? And as you and I both know, defense is never the way to win.
That's right.
It's always got to be
once
going
you're on defense,
offense.
you're on defense forever.
Exactly.
You know, I try to show people how easy it is to win. You know, I have this idea that if 1% of the people organized in Congress watchdog groups in every congressional district, and even less than 1%, we've had far less than 1% is 2.5 million people, adults organized, and if they spent 300 to 500 hours a year connected with each other around major turnarounds in the American people, the usual, like adequate wages, right to form labor unions, full Medicare for all, the ones that are long overdue compared to Western Europe, which we're going to get to in a moment. As long as they represent public opinion, they can turn the Congress around no matter how powerful the drug companies are, no matter how powerful Amazon is, no matter how powerful the banks are. And I give examples to this. We did it in the 60s with a few thousand people around. Because once you have majority opinion behind you and you've got a small but committed watchdog group watching the two senators and representatives, you start getting press because the press will finally cover popular power if they see it's powerful, if they see that they can summon members of Congress to their own town meetings. Do you agree with the 1%?
Oh, yes. In fact, it's been empirically discovered by some political scientists based in Princeton. The lead author of the study is based in Princeton. It's easily Googleable by going on the internet and asking for the oligarchy study. What they did was looked at examples of federal policies. They aggregated about over 1,500 different federally made decisions over a period of 20 years and asked about each decision, where did the majority viewpoint stand on that, and where did the economic elite, the so-called 1%, stand on that? And of course, often there was overlap. But when the majority took one position and the economic elite took a different position, it was the economic elite that almost every case won its point of view. In other words, the study reluctantly concluded if democracy is the rule by the majority, that's not what we have in the United States.
And it's called the Oligarchy Project?
Well, the authors themselves didn't call it the oligarchy. The BBC, in covering it, called it that. But the authors basically said this is no longer a democracy. The lead author for that study was a guy named Martin Gilens of Princeton, Gilens. And so it can be discovered by either Googling Martin Gilens, because BBC named it the Oligarchy Study. That's the simple way. Just go Googling the Oligarchy Study and you'll find it. The point I want to make about that is that people in agreement with Princeton are feeling helpless and hopeless, and that it really is a 1% led or governed country, then it would require an enormous lot of wins, I think. And my book is about how to win local campaigns and regional campaigns so we can get that sense of self-confidence. But it would take enormous lot of those for people to unite across the dividing lines of different issues and understand, because so many of the progressive issues have the same veto that they face on the federal level, which is the economic elite, then it would make sense for our movements to merge and to unite and do what they did in the Viking countries. That is, what the Nordics did was they united various movements for progressive change and threw out the economic elite's rule ended
Yes, and
the
let's get
domination.
to that. This is a great
Okay.
book, listeners.
Yeah.
It's called Viking Economics. Should have
Mhm.
been a bestseller. The problem is we grow up in a culture where millions of students are told America's number one, number one, number one. There's nothing we have to learn from other countries. So we develop a kind of cultural arrogance which hurts our country because we aren't number one in many areas, and we've got a lot to learn from other countries. I mean, the whole credit union movement, which now has 70 million Americans, members of credit unions, came from Canada, came from Quebec over 100 years ago. They came to New Hampshire and taught people in New Hampshire how to form a credit union and be free of the banks. So I'm looking at this book, Viking Economics, and I'm saying to myself, why didn't I hear about it until about 5 months ago? It came out, what, 3 years ago?
Yeah, 2016, right.
Okay. Because what it does, it provides more than a vision. If you can't envision anything, you can't imagine real possibilities. And we're short on vision, as you pointed out, in our country. And the academic world is short on vision.
Very short.
As pointed out in the book, The End of Utopia, by a professor some years ago. So you have been, of course, to Scandinavia many times. You married.
I actually lived there, learned the language.
Lived there.
Norwegian.
You married a Scandinavian. And you start out in a very stunning way. You say, in 1900, Norway was a severely impoverished country. It was a poor country. And when I went to Norway for the first time in the 1960s, which was no more than 18 years after World War II, when Norway was quite pummeled by the Nazis, it was like an economic paradise. And that was in 1963 or so. By the way, I went there and I went to the Scandinavian countries, George, because I wanted to bring back the concept of the ombudsman to America. So
well done.
I drafted a bill for the Connecticut legislature, start an ombudsman, which would be an arm of the legislature, watchdogging the executive branch in Hartford. And I was accused of fronting for the Danish lobby.
Ralph, I didn't know this story. I didn't know this, the origin of the rise of the ombudsman here in the U.S.
So you were describing Norway and others, and why don't you just talk about some of the ways people in Scandinavia live, work, how they're paid, the social safety net. And it was all done by, as you pointed out, coalitions of labor unions, cooperatives,
farmers, family farmers, very strongly so. Yeah, they did develop a vision that was very, very crucial for them because, as you know, whenever you have division in a country, there are the people in the middle who haven't committed one way or the other, and they're looking at, well, what's being offered here? And very smartly, the Progressive Coalition offered a vision. They said, look, in the society we propose to organize, you will have health care. There will be no question about you getting what you needed from the healthcare system because it will be designed for you. And you will have access to higher education for free because we don't think people should have to pay for higher education. And you will have universal pensions because we don't believe that old people should be poor. In fact, we don't even think anybody should be poor. We think poverty is so 19th century. There's just no reason why a modern country should put up with poverty, and we're going to roll up our sleeves and deal with that, which, as you said, by the time you got there in 1963, they'd gotten rid of their slums. They used to have terrible slums in Oslo. No, they'd gotten rid of them. They'd gotten rid of poverty. So what the Norwegians and Swedes and Danes did in somewhat different decades, mostly the 1920s and around in there, early in the 20th century, was they went to the broader number of people, the people in the middle, and said, look, wouldn't you like to subscribe to this? That means you need to help us do the heavy lifting to make it happen. And so now they enjoy, affordable childcare for everyone, right? One of the things I think is really wrong is discrimination against women in the workplace because of women's traditional place being in the home with babies. Well, that's a crazy idea. There should be affordable childcare for all. And if, for example, Ralph, let's say that you're a mom, you're working in a firm, there's a nursery in the firm, so you can bring your baby to the nursery. You get up to 2 hours worth of nursing time on the job, and you're paid for it. That's what they're
In
doing.
the U.S.,
too.
they don't even have universal maternal
Leave, that's right. And that was one of the earliest things. Of course, people should have maternity leave and paternity leave. And so they've got fathers being able to continue their wages while they're home taking care of the children.
How about
so
paid family sick leave and grandparent family sick leave?
all of that. Sick leave is also paid. If you need to, you have a child highly disabled, then you're definitely paid for that. And there's family allowance for each child anyway on the top of whatever the special needs might be. So even if you're a rich Norwegian, you still get an allotment for the expenses of raising a child because, and here's the clink, this is the most important chapter, I think, in my book, which is that instead of creating programs for poor people, they understood they needed to create universal programs that provide benefits for everyone, and then everyone will defend them. And so, for example, universal pension for all people, whether they're well off or, working stiffs who haven't been able to put that much money aside, it's not a problem because there's the universal pension, there's the universal health care, there's universal everything. And that really makes a huge difference in winning over people, first of all, and then implementing a system that provides way more equality than we can even dream of.
Chuck Collins reviewed your book, and he quotes you as saying, I'm quoting you, movements need organizers, communicators, advocates, funders, nurturers, researchers, trainers, musicians, and artists, nonviolent warriors, and foot soldiers, as well as visionary designers. And you add, all were present in the Nordic movements that challenged 1,000 years of poverty and oppression, took the offensive and built democracy, end quote. Your Nordic model can serve as an inspiring model for our country. Now, here's the question. You haven't even begun to describe the many support systems there are in Scandinavia. And they also have a much more vibrant foreign aid program. I mean, when I went through Scandinavia, I concluded their major problem was boredom.
Well, what they do is have an efflorescence of culture in response to boredom. So many musicians that there aren't even enough concert venues. In the summer, there are pop-up concerts by bands all over the place and so on because everybody's looking for performance space. It's a tremendous artistic and a place for theater. Every village has a cultural center where you can take lessons. You can learn to play jazz or whatever it is you want to learn. Kilns for the pottery makers and so on. They don't think work should be taking us over. In fact, they only work, the average now is 38 hours per week, and their national goal is to go to 30 hours a week because they want people to have more time for hiking in the woods, enjoying skiing in the winter, being with their families, and meditating or doing whatever it is that they do for their spiritual lives.
And what is the paid vacation? In this country, if you're not part of a union and get a paid vacation, there is no
5 weeks
vacation.
is standard. 5 weeks is standard. You might get 6 weeks if you have a particularly stressful job.
6 weeks paid vacation.
Yeah.
How about Sweden? Isn't it 7?
Same. One of the interesting things to me about the Nordic countries is they really watch each other and compete with each other for positive things. So if Norway's making a quick, nearer goal for going carbon neutral, for example, because climate is hugely on people's minds, then the Swedish Parliament on pressure to advance their goal for going.
That's right. I noticed that. And you put Finland in the same category. You put Netherlands too.
Not the Netherlands. Finland has a similar economic model. Netherlands is more capitalistic than the Nordic countries are.
But of course, they do have capitalism.
So their inequality is great.
It's a mixed economy.
Oh, yeah, they do. It's a mixed economy. So, yeah, they do have capitalists. In fact, one of my favorite articles that I read while doing research was in Inc. magazine, which is a capitalist magazine. The senior editor headed his article on Norway. In Norway, capitalists say "ja" to socialism.
Yeah, that's a Boston-based magazine, by the way. We're talking with George Lakey, author of Viking Economics and the brand new book, How We Win, A Guide to Nonviolent Direct Action Campaigning. Years ago, I read a book called Sweden, the Middle Way by Marcus Childs, I think.
Yes, I've read that. It's a beautiful
and
book.
the idea was to say Sweden is the middle way between socialism and capitalism. It's a mixed system, and it works. And it was really a bestseller, and it got terrific reviews. But I don't think it was as interestingly as written as your Viking Economics. What kind of reviews did you get on NPR and PBS when the book came out?
Well, the good news is that as soon as it came out, Bloomberg.com felt required to write about it. Atlantic Monthly wrote about it. Time Magazine put an article in about it. So it did get the Times. London has a higher education section which anoints a book of the week each week, and I got book of the week in London. So it definitely got some important mainstream.
NPR and PBS?
NPR, Chicago, New York, some of the big stations and major market stations, but not as much as I expected, actually.
Well, did Steve or David, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. This is the big question before we run out of time here, is what do you say to the people in America who say, well, that's all very fine for them, but this country is too big, unwieldy, and diverse to be able to scale those universal programs up?
Well, I was wondering the same thing as a researcher. What's the applicability to the U.S.? And I learned a big lesson when I walked into an Oslo-based research institute in Norway to interview the senior researchers there. I saw a photograph on the wall that showed a delegation, what looked like a delegation of Chinese people. I said, well, that's interesting. And they said, yeah, they were sent by the government of Beijing. They were top economists and policymakers and so on. And they were sent to Norway to learn from us things that might be useful to them. Well, my jaw dropped open because China makes the United States look small. And also China makes the United States look homogeneous by comparison with China. And there were Chinese experts in Norway, tiny Norway, 5 million people. So, yeah, so the interviewers said, the people I was going to interview said, yeah, we were wondering the same thing. In fact, we first of all asked them when we got sat down at the table, we said, look, why are you here? And they said, look, economics is actually very complex. It's got a lot of subsystems and so on. We know that you've been a kind of laboratory. That's the way we look at you. We look at you as a laboratory for trying things out. Some things you've tried have worked, some things have not. And we're very interested in the things that worked for you because maybe they can be scaled up, because in economics there are things that can be scaled up beautifully and then other things that aren't so much. And there are some innovations that are culturally specific and others that are universal. And we are very pragmatic people. China is interested in getting the best from any place we can get it. And that got me thinking about Social Security. You know, in the United States, we absolutely depend on it, but it works great in Iceland with 320,000 people, and it works great in the United States, except ours isn't nearly as generous as the Nordic version of Social Security.
Before we conclude, George Lakey, let me toss you a softball, because I know there's some listeners who are about to ask themselves, why doesn't Ralph ask George Lakey how high the taxes are in Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway? That's where they get all their goodies. They're the highest tax people in the world.
So true, and they're so happy to pay it. Prime Minister bragged to the New York Times that he ran twice, winning. Prime Minister of Norway won twice by promising the Norwegian people that he would not lower their taxes. So the attitude in Scandinavia is, let's get what we really want, and then, of course, we have to pay for it. In other words, there's no such thing as a high-quality life on the cheap. You need to pay for what you get, and if you're willing to pay a lot, you will get a lot. That's true in a democracy. It would not be true in an oligarchy like we have, but it would be true if we had a democracy.
Just to summarize, how high are the taxes in Norway and Sweden and Denmark? Are they over 40%? Not to mention what people get for their taxes, which we don't get.
Right. It can be 40%, can be 50% in different countries. The marginal tax rate is not as high as it was in the mid-60s in the United States, actually. So we actually had a higher marginal tax rate back in the day than they did.
And then there's the intangibles, aren't there, Mr. Lakey? The level of anxiety, dread, fear in this country is far, far greater. The economic insecurity. You can lose your life savings. You cannot get health care. You have double jobs at low pay. There's no unions to bargain for you. You got to pay $800 a month for daycare. On and on and on. Not inadequate mass transit, for example. So you can't put a dollar figure on the low level of anxiety, fear, and dread in Scandinavian countries compared to ours.
That's true. I think anyone, certainly my Norwegian relatives, would much prefer not to live in what they see as an extremely high stress country called the United States. And yet there is also an economic price that we pay. We pay a high economic price for the stress that we experience. The medical issues, we're losing life expectancy, for example. It's very hard for me to imagine the kind of violence that Americans experience and the tremendous costliness of cleaning up after all the violence that we have, and the tremendous costliness of police, the number of police we have, and the tremendous waste of money on prisons and so on. All of that we wouldn't have if we had an egalitarian society like the Nordics.
I have a quick question because Ralph kind of touched on this earlier. The identity politics in America serves the billionaire class. If we're fighting among each other, we're not going to come after the billionaire class and demand that they pay their fair share. What do we see in Scandinavia when it comes to, identity politics and people fighting among each other? Does a rising tide lift all boats? And do people not hate each other as much as they do here in the United States? Because we hate each other. So we don't want to give each other health care.
They do have identity defined groups that have moved forward strongly without the kind of strife that we've had. And I think the major reason for the difference is because our society is so polarized by inequality. Now, this is another study, actually. This is a study that was done by a trio of political scientists who are trying to figure out, where does our polarization come from and why does it vary? Sometimes, like in the 1950s, it was not great, but now, of course, it's enormous. And what they found was that in the polarization follows the curve of inequality. The more inequality, the more polarization. Well, because the Nordics went through this process of egalitarianism and working their economy in a way that promoted equality rather than promoted inequality, it means that their differences, for example, the women's movement in those countries, the LGBT movement in those countries, yes, they were movements gathered around identity, but they didn't need to face the nastiness that movements here face around identity, and that makes them very defensive, of course, and then attack even more. They didn't have to face that because they were emerging in the context of a more egalitarian society in which people could say, well, okay, so we're all Swedes together here, and we have these discontented women who, yeah, they have a point, don't they? So I guess we have to change ways we've been.
I mean, can you sell? I'm sorry to belabor this, but can you sell this to the American people, or at least the Democratic Party? I think Bernie tried to. Can you say class struggle trumps women's rights, the rights of gays, the plight of the African Americans, that we have to all come together and focus on class struggle? Can that be a winning platform for the Democrats?
No, I don't think it's focusing. I mean, Bernie ran into that, right, when he was focusing so much on class and the rule of the 1% that identity groups were saying, but what about us? What about us? So I go back, I was very influenced by Bayard Rustin, who was the lead strategist for the civil rights movement, very close to Dr. King, who kept saying that, especially given our history of enslavement in this country, that especially the racial struggle is very bound up in our economic struggle, and that we need to learn to see how these various sources of discrimination and prejudice are connected to the economic machinery such that we can unite as groups that are in some way marginalized. Working class people are marginalized, but also women and so on, see our marginalities as having in common the need to push the economic elite aside, which is actually ruling by dividing, and instead create an actual working democracy. And once we have a democracy, then the intensity of the sense of marginalization declines.
Well, we're unfortunately out of time. We've been talking with George Lakey, the author of Viking Economics and the new book, How We Win, A Guide to Nonviolent Direct Action Campaigning. I hope that you're going to do some webinars and seminars without having to travel very much so you can reach more and more people who are very, very serious in their living rooms and in their club rooms so we can organize these Congress watchdog groups. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, David and Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been speaking with activist and author George Lakey, whose book, Viking Economics, How the Scandinavians Got It Right and How We Can Too. We will link to that at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we're going to talk about how you can stop all those annoying telemarketing robocalls with Ian Barlow, coordinator of the Do Not Call program at the Federal Trade Commission. Now let's check in with Russell Mokhiber in Washington, D.C.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, February 8, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. They charge their clients fees as they gave bad advice. They charge their clients fees for doing nothing at all. And sometimes they kept charging the fees after their customers had died. A royal commission appointed by the Australian government released a stinging report that criticized the country's powerful banking and financial service industry for bilking consumers and called for tougher regulations. That's according to a report in the New York Times. The report found that loan officers, mortgage brokers, and many others acted to line their own pockets rather than helping customers. The report urged the government to rein in an industry that it said too often operated with a cavalier disregard for the welfare of the Australian people. Saying sorry and promising not to do it again has not prevented recurrence, said the report's authors. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. The Federal Trade Commission is a bipartisan federal agency with a unique dual mission in the marketplace. Number one, to protect consumers. Number two, to promote competition. Here from the FTC to let us know how to protect ourselves from unwanted phone calls is our next guest.
Ian Barlow is an attorney who works at the Federal Trade Commission as the coordinator for the Do Not Call program. Thank you for taking our call. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ian Barlow.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get right to it. It's not a problem that needs much definition. Who doesn't get these robocalls again and again? And last year, according to the FTC, over 26 billion with a B, robocalls were placed in U.S. phone numbers last year. And that was up from 18 billion in 2017. So you can see the trend is getting incredibly intrusive. And I know a lot of people, and I'm sure my listeners do, where people don't pick up their phone anymore. Or if they rush for their phone, they may trip and fall and find out it's a robocall from some country overseas. And there are also non-robocalls that are very intrusive from people who called to sell something. So what can be done about this?
Well, you're right that it's a pervasive problem that affects a lot of people. At the FTC, we get about 400,000 to 500,000 complaints per month about unwanted calls, about 65 to 70% of which are about robocalls as we define them, pre-recorded messages. So at the FTC, we are keenly aware that it is a pervasive problem. And we have 4 standard pieces of advice that we give to consumers for how they can limit or reduce abusive and unwanted calls. But I do want to be clear. I don't know that there's a silver bullet that's going to stop all the calls, but we have some good advice that can help people reduce it and also aid our law enforcement efforts. So
let's
the first thing
hear
we
the
recommend,
four pieces of advice.
Sure. So first, we recommend everybody register their phones for the National Do Not Call Registry. This won't on its own prevent all calls, but it's going to do a couple of things. First, registering for the Do Not Call Registry will prevent calls from the telemarketers that comply with the law. So those people who do their duty and download the registry are not going to call you if you register. Second, it's going to let you know that if you still get a telemarketing call and you're on the Do Not Call Registry, it's likely illegal, and you don't want to do business with people who are calling you illegally. So it's also a good way to identify who's a legitimate caller and who's not. That leads to my second point, hang up. If they're using illegal method to contact you, you don't want to do business with that company or person, and you don't want to give them your personal information. So just hang up right away.
And you don't even want to press 2 or 3 the way they ask you to.
Yeah, we do not recommend that. We recommend just hanging up immediately and not interacting, not indicating in any way that the phone number is a valid phone number that's fielded by a live human being. And telemarketers look at their call records after the fact, right? Often, fraudsters too. And they say, look, these are people we were on the phone with for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 5 minutes. That's an almost sale. Or somebody we almost persuaded with our scam. Let's try them again. If you hang up immediately, you're less likely to be lopped into that category. So then our third piece of advice is report. Report the unwanted calls, abusive calls, or illegal calls to us at the Federal Trade Commission by going to donotcall.gov. And that's the same place consumers can register for the Do Not Call registry. Just report the unwanted calls at donotcall.gov. The more data we have and the more complete information we have, the better we can target our law enforcement and the better we can understand the problem. And then the fourth piece of advice we have to consumers is we recommend they consider a call blocking application or call blocking solution for their cell phones and landlines. For cell phones, there are a lot of call blocking apps on the market in the Android and iPhone app stores, hundreds of apps available. And now many of the carriers are also making call blocking solutions available for home phones. For home phones, the best option is to contact your telephone service provider to see what options are available. But to summarize, the 4 pieces of advice we give to consumers are: 1, go to donotcall.gov and register for the Do Not Call registry. 2, hang up on unwanted, abusive, or illegal calls. 3, report the unwanted, illegal, or abusive calls at donotcall.gov. And 4, consider a call blocking application.
And still they pour into people's homes. In other words, as you say, there isn't a real fix yet. You may reduce some of them, but look at the figures. They're going from 17 billion to 20 robocalls a year in 2017 to 26 billion robocalls in 2018. So the callers are clever. They're designing around. How do they get over these things? How do they keep bypassing all these efforts that you point out?
Well, I think the first thing is the cost of placing robocalls is really low. It's really incredibly inexpensive to dial outbound internet-based telephone calls using VoIP technology, voice over IP. This technology is so inexpensive that it allows fraudsters and legitimate telemarketers, companies that have a legitimate product, but nevertheless advertise and market their product in a abusive way. It lets them just mass dial at a volume and rate that, it makes it an incredibly efficient way for them to contact people. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. First, the minutes for long distance via VoIP dialing are incredibly inexpensive. There are few barriers to entry into this market, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of small companies that willingly provide voice over IP for people who are engaged in auto dialing. The second thing is the auto dialing software is widely available, basically free, available as open source software that anybody can go and download. And so it's just an incredibly inexpensive method of reaching potential customers or potential victims for a fraud.
So what's the solution? I know our listeners are saying, I'm on the do not call list. I hang up. I try to report once in a while. I'll look into these blocking apps. Is that the big defense, the blocking apps? Are they more effective than everything else combined?
Well, the blocking of apps do offer a lot of protection for many consumers. And there are all different kinds of apps. They have different ways of approaching this situation. So some of these apps will block everybody except the call in your contact list, right? But that may be too aggressive for some people. Maybe, you have kids in school and you don't want to miss an automated call from their school. So you want a little less aggressive app. And so there are many different varieties available, but that's one really effective method for consumers to protect themselves right now. But, going forward, there are some technological advancements and solutions that the telecom industry is working on that we're pretty hopeful that they can help restore trust in the telephone network.
Well, I hope this has been a little satisfying to our listeners and they don't give up their hands. How can they contact the FTC again? You want to give that contact number?
Sure. So the best thing to do is, if you have complaints, to file them at donotcall.gov, and it's a really easy system.
Is there a 1-800 number for a human being?
It's 888-382-1222.
So it's 888-382-1222.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Ian Barlow of the Federal Trade Commission, and we're looking forward to some more powerful technological fix and, if possible, more strenuous enforcement action.
Well, thank you very much, and we're proud of our enforcement. We've done 139 cases, 126 are finished. We've got $1.5 billion in judgments and $121 million in actual collections in our robocall and do not call cases. And we're very proud of it, but we thank you for the opportunity to talk to consumers about our robocall program and what they can do to help themselves. You're
very welcome. I hope NPR and PBS avail themselves of a similar interview with you.
We hope so too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking with Ian Barlow of the Federal Trade Commission, who coordinates the Do Not Call program. We will link to that program at ralphnaderradiohour.com. So, Ralph, we have a little time. Do you want to comment on President Trump's State of the Union address?
Yes, there are a lot of comments, obviously. It's an hour-and-a-half address, but most of it he had nothing to do with, other than the fear he's projecting on a border crisis and the catastrophe coming from the caravans, which people on the border denied in subsequent interviews. But most of it, including the people he interviewed, including his rosy description and selective description of economic progress, most of it he had nothing to do with. Number two is that he had one sentence that was very ominous that I think the media missed when he said, "We can have war and investigations," looking at the members of Congress. "We can have war and investigations, or we can have peace and legislation." I read that to mean if the House of Representatives starts cornering Trump in terms of corruption and other problems, he'll start a war with Iran or some other country. Right. And I think that alternative that he posed and the agenda behind it should be more thoroughly explored by the media. The third was Stacey Abrams gave a very pleasing campaign speech for her possible run for the U.S. Senate from Georgia. I would have preferred if she devoted the speech to what Donald Trump didn't talk about, because he created a fantasy world about workers. In fact, right now, thousands of workers are about to be laid off in the GM Lordstown plant in Ohio that produces the Chevy Cruze, and Trump has avoided facing up to that, even though he threatened GM a couple of years ago that if they went to Mexico and they closed the plants, he'd go after them. And I sent an email to Trump saying that GM is making a fool out of you, Mr. Trump. What are you going to do about the Lordstown plant? It would have been nice if she had talked about what Trump left out, which is why he gets away with so much fantasy and lying. It's what he leaves out.
Right.
If you were speaker, would you appease him?
You know, once you're in that situation of a State of the Union address by the President of the United States, you have to be polite.
No, I'm talking about in negotiations on the wall.
Oh, no, you cannot give him a wall, because then you have said, Mr. Trump, you can shut down the federal government and oppress and discomfort and jeopardize millions of Americans to get some little thing you want from the Congress. We're never going to give you that kind of freebie. You will never shut down the federal government as a negotiating position.
So she shouldn't give him anything. There's talk of giving him $1 billion towards the wall.
You'll see.
Well, would you do that? Would you give him $1 billion?
I wouldn't give him anything relating to a barrier on the wall, because then he'll crow about it and say, look, it worked. I shut down the government and the Democrats gave me the wall, regardless of what word they use to describe it. And they know that if they give him anything for a barrier, they're going to reward his shutting down the government. And he can do it again and again and get away with it.
And so can others later on with that example.
So she should just say no and let him shut the government down again.
No, he won't shut the government. He'll either cave and say that he got some added money for border security and he's sending more soldiers down there, or he'll try an emergency declaration, which will split the Republican Party in the Senate. Senator McConnell has implied that would happen and urged him not to do it. So hold firm, Democrats in the House.
That's our show. I want to thank our guests again today, George Lakey of How We Win and Viking Economics, and Ian Barlow, coordinator of the Do Not Call program at the FTC. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to check out now. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
For Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out. The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformedcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump Presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak to the former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Gregory Yaskow, about how he changed his mind about nuclear power. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And it looks like people are ordering 5 to 10 copies at a time on How the Rats Reformed the Congress. And it looks like they're having neighborhood discussions or living room discussions. That's when it all starts. That's how it all starts. And that's what we're looking for. Go to ratsreformcongress.org.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where we first dive a little deeper into our conversation with Ian Barlow of the Do Not Call program, and David shares a technique he uses to discourage unwanted phone calls.
We're talking with Ian Barlow of the Federal Trade Commission. Ian, when you do catch them and you put enforcement on them, what do? Do you put them out of business? Do you fine them? Do they bounce back? Do we know their names? Do you put out a press release when you prosecute these people? Give us a sense of when you win.
Yeah, so it's yes to all of those things. First, all our cases, any case the FTC brings is public. It's in federal court. And we issue a press release. They're all available on our website. Second, we bring our cases in federal court, and we bring them sort of in 2 separate ways. The first bucket is we have cases against fraudsters. These are robocall scams, pitching worthless products, fake debt relief services, right? Where they say, pay us $500 and we will reduce your credit card debt. And then there is no product there. They don't do it. That's all fraud. When we sue those kind of fraudsters, we typically go into court ex parte. We don't provide notice to the targets. We get the judge to approve a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. We shut down the business. The court appoints a receiver. We freeze its assets. Often we go into the premises and obtain their documents, and the receiver winds down the business, and we try and give as much money back as possible to the victims.
Is there an exception for nonprofit robocallers, charities?
Yeah, the charity cases are distinct, and the rules are a little different in how they apply to charities. And the actual nonprofit charities, the FTC does not have jurisdiction over. Of course, we do have jurisdiction over their telefunders who make the calls on their behalf. But in the charity space, the FTC mostly operates against fraudulent charities that are really not charities. I can give you a great example. Over the summer, we brought a case against a man named Travis Deloy Peterson, he was doing business as Veterans of America, pretending to solicit donations to go to wounded veterans and veterans who had served in the military. And he was getting people to donate their cars, their boats. But in fact, Travis Tully Peterson had no charity. He didn't even have a business incorporated. He sold the boats and cars and kept the money for himself. So that's the kind of thing we do in the charity space. And that sort of plays into our fraud program.
I have a friend who, a few years ago, filed suit in small claims court against an unwanted calling company, and he collected up to $1,500 for his suits. Is that still available to people?
Yes. So the remedy that consumers can use to file suit themselves is available under what's called the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Now, that's not a law that the FTC administers or has jurisdiction over, but it is available, and there are a lot of individual lawsuits, and there are also a lot of class action lawsuits under that statute. So consumers who have the time and want to do it, that's certainly a mechanism they can take advantage of.
There are other serious consequences. You can't get people on the phone anymore because it's all voicemail. They don't answer their phone because there's so many robocalls and unwanted calls that they don't want to even hang up on. And so it ruptures the normal use of telephones. You can't get people on the phone anymore. Neighbors, friends, colleagues, whatever. It's all voicemail.
That's exactly right, Ralph. And that's why the telecom industry is now working on one of the biggest technology solutions to this problem, because they want to restore trust in the telephone network. They don't want people to stop calling. And so the telecom industry is advancing something called STIR/SHAKEN, which is secure telephony identity recognition. But basically, it's to let people know the caller ID number calling you is really owned by the person who's using it, and this is a verified call. And it's exactly like you said, the telecom industry doesn't want to see people not using the phone anymore for telephone calls. And so that's really on the horizon as one of the biggest potential solutions and fixes for this problem.
We're out of time, unless you want to ask a question, David.
Well, one of the things I do, and maybe this is just for my own mental health, is if I get it, I'll press 1 or 2 and I get a live human being on the phone, I'll go, "Oh, hi, can you hang out for 1 second?" And then I just put the phone down and I go back to whatever it is I'm doing, and I keep picking the phone up. Hang on for 1 second. I kind of rob them of their time, but that's pushing
somebody who has a lot of time.
I mean, can we waste their time?
Yeah.
Is there?
On the individual level, that's probably very satisfying for you, and we get that. But we think that does make it somewhat more likely that you personally will get more calls. But on the other hand, there is one call blocking app that basically works in the manner you suggested. They have bots, automated robots, basically answer the call and interact with the scammers to waste their time. So you're not the only person out there who thinks that's the right way to go.
Now, David and Ralph have a side conversation about Medicare for All.
Can I ask you a question for the podcast? Because I know we're out of time. Medicare for All. United Healthcare Group made $200 billion in 2017. How are we going to have Medicare for all in this country without putting them out of business? How do we do this?
Well, Medicare put health insurance companies out of business except for Medicare Gap when it was passed in the 1960s. So there is a clear precedent for that. You can't have a single payer system and have insurance companies selling at the same time, because a single payer system is based on universal coverage, accessibility, and affordability, not stratifying consumers what they can get and not get depending on the insurance company they have. And by the way, they didn't make $200 billion.
They had revenue.
No company makes $200 billion in profits in America. Maybe sales.
They had revenue of $200 billion.
Yeah, you got to say that.
Yeah. But so do you think that Bernie and the Democrats can run on Medicare for all, which is feasible? It's cheaper, but they have to put $3.5 trillion a year industry out of business. How do you do that? We couldn't even put the tobacco companies out of business.
Well, no, they wouldn't put 3.5. I mean, there'll still be drug companies, for example, but they would be subject to reasonable price regulation the way they are in Canada. So, but you would put the health insurance company part of that out of business. But, they still get business, David, because then they contract to deliver the service. It's like United Healthcare contracts with the AARP, and Sallie Mae contracts with the Department of Education for student loans. They just don't sell the service, but they administer it, and that can be profitable for them. I think because of what we spend on healthcare, in any given year in the last 20 years, if the taxpayers bought out the major health insurance companies, it would have been a bargain compared to what they would have saved in those same years. Just bought the stock out completely and shut it down. That's how gouging the health insurance economy is.
Or to nationalize the health insurance, not to just put them out of business, but to nationalize them.
Then you get to the delivery in Britain. Britain is a socialized system. The Canadian system is public payment, private delivery of health care.
Right. I mean, that's really interesting to say to the American people and to Wall Street, we're going to buy out the health insurance, the largest health insurance companies. It's going to be a corporate buyout, and then we're going to manage.
We're going to be the payors.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to come to that. In Canada, they just replaced the private health insurance, period.
I'm just wondering if that's an easier sell to the American people.
Well, it's good public rhetoric because you say they cost us so much, it would be efficient just to buy their stock and put them out of business. So it's another argument for single payer.
Or not put them out of business, build on what they're doing right.
No, you put them out of their business. And the government pays. The government pays half the insurance. The government already pays state, federal, and local. They already pay half of the $3.5 trillion, and they pay gouging prices for it. A single-payer system is much more frugal, much more efficient. Canada produces coverage for everybody in Canada, free choice of doctor and hospital, better outcomes on half the per capita cost that we have in this country, where there's still 29 million people without health insurance and millions more underinsured.
And do we know what socialized medicine or single payer does to the animal spirits when it comes to innovation? We talked about that earlier. Don't we have great discoveries coming out of Germany and France and England and Canada with...
Well, that's a completely different budget category. We have, more than any other country, a research and development budget coming out of the National Institutes of Health. Nobody can match that in any foreign country. And that can go on regardless of what the health insurance system is all about, and does. And that's why we produce more than our proportionate share of innovations like medical devices and pharmaceuticals.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we speak to the former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Gregory Jasko, about what changed his mind about nuclear power.
Stand up, you've been sitting ready.